Hey nerds, just Jamie here with
your friend Claude.
And this is Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. Today's movies are paired up for a multitude of reasons. First, they both feature commentary on and satirical elements about tyrannical governments. Right. They are based on written works by famous sci-fi authors of the past. They both take place in space, so that means they're both science fiction. They both are also ultra-violent, and finally, they are both directed by Paul Verhoeven. They are 1990's Total Recall and 1997's Starship Troopers. Before we get into the basics and all the other segments today, are there any initial thoughts on your end about these movies?
My end has several thoughts, and I think it has mostly to do with when I saw these movies, the age I was. Starship Troopers I saw first, even though Total Recall's older. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, I don't know if it was I was not really exposed to that type of movie, that the violence and I don't know, the brutality, I guess, of it. I sort of shied away from that in my youth, but I went and saw this in the theater, and I even remember on the drive home, like, watching like the hills and just like kind of imagining bugs flooding over them and just feeling really deeply affected by it. It was weird.
Both of these movies are movies that I enjoy, and they rank very highly on my personal favorite movies list. That's not based on scoring, that's just based on instinct and feeling. They both flirt with being in my top 5. So I'm actually very curious.
Big deal.
Yeah, well, I haven't worked it out yet myself, so I'm very curious what the scores are going to look like and how this is going to turn out. All right, that being said, Claude's going to move out of the way. I'm going to take center stage and go over some basics.
Total excitement.
I lost him. There! Fasten your seatbelt.
Total adventure.
You guys in trouble!
Now you've done it!
Total experience.
Get ready for the big surprise.
You wouldn't hurt me. After all, we're married.
Total Schwarzenegger.
Consider that a divorce.
Total Recall.
All right, as promised, here I am. Let's talk basics for today's movies. Up first is 1990's Total Recall. Directing, obviously, we have Paul Verhoeven, as we already discussed. He's most known for the films in today's episode, in addition to RoboCop and Basic Instinct. There are, of course, more films to his credit, but those are the 4 big ones that most people talk about when Verhoeven comes up. There are several names associated with the writing of this movie. Before we talk about them, we should mention first that the movie is based on a 1966 short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale by famed sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. Okay, that said, story credit here goes to Ronald Schwarzenegger, Dan O'Bannon, and John Poville. Schwarzenegger and O'Bannon are known for developing the story for Ridley Scott's Alien together as a team, among many other things. By himself, Schwarzenegger is also involved with Above the Law and Freejack, while O'Bannon is known for Dark Star, Heavy Metal, and Life Force. Poville's primary credits include writing for several versions of Star Trek on TV, as well as Sliders. Screenwriting credit goes to Schwarzenegger and O'Bannon, this time with Gary Goldman. Goldman was brought in to rework the third act. Goldman was also a writer for John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China. The music here is headed up by Jerry Goldsmith, who we just mentioned on the previous episode of this show for King Solomon's Mines. His career is extensive. It includes several Star Trek films, several Omen films, Alien, Poltergeist, Gremlins, Rambo, Hoosiers, Basic Instinct, and many others. If you like movies, if you've watched movies, it's likely that you've heard Goldsmith's work. All right, so let's talk about the cast. First up is the Austrian oak himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger, making another appearance on our show and faring much better this time than he has in the past, as construction worker turned action hero Douglas Quaid, and as evil corporate spy Carl Hauser, who both inhabit the same mind and body. Which character is the real guy? You can only watch and decide for yourself. Schwarzenegger, in addition to this movie, is best known, of course, for the Conan and Terminator films, as well as Predator, and many other action classics over a 4-decade span, stretching from the 80s to now. Next up, as evil tycoon on Mars, Vilos Cohagen, is Ronnie Cox. Cox is best known for this film, Beverly Hills Cop 1 and 2, and Verhoeven's RoboCop. Michael Ironside plays Cohagen's henchman Richter. Ironside is known for Scanners, Top Gun, and Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. Rachel Ticotin plays freedom fighter Melina. Ticotin is also known from Falling Down and Con Air. Next up is Sharon Stone, making another appearance on the show. Again, she was just on the last episode. She plays Quaid's wife and secret agent Lori. Stone is best known for Above the Law, Casino, The Quick and the Dead, and Paul Verhoeven's Basic Instinct. A lot of connections here. All right, finishing up the cast, we have Marshall Bell as George and the mutant revolutionary leader Quado. Michael Champion plays Richter's assistant Helm. Mel Johnson Jr. as mutant taxi driver Benny. Roy Brocksmith plays recall employee Dr. Edgemar. Rosemary Dunsmore plays recall employee Dr. Lull. And Ray Baker plays recall employee Bob McLean. Leisha Naff must also be mentioned as the famed three-breasted prostitute Mary. And finally, I'll mention Dean Norris as mutant freedom fighter Tony. Okay, so the development of this film actually started way back in 1974 when Shusett bought the rights. He and O'Bannon wrote the first script using the Dick story as a basis for the story in the film. Really only covered the first third. They had to develop additional details for the second and the third acts. This script was considered unfilmable at the time due to the necessary budget and the effects that would be needed. Remember, this was the mid-70s. Shusett returned to the project in the 80s, although the final third of the film was still not kind of figured out. David Cronenberg was brought on board as the director. He worked on 12 different script drafts himself. Ultimately, Cronenberg's more serious tone, similar to something like Blade Runner, was at odds with Shusett and O'Bannon's desire to have a more adventurous tone, so they moved on again. Now they were under Dino De Laurentiis, and through the next several years, actors as wide-ranging as Richard Dreyfuss, William Hurt, Christopher Reeve, Jeff Bridges were all considered for the lead role. And actually, at one point, Patrick Swayze was officially cast. Unfortunately, the financial collapse of De Laurentiis' DEG company caused the film to go up for grabs again. Schwarzenegger at some point had become aware of the script at this time and convinced Karolko to pick it up. He retained a lot of control of the production. He basically acted as a producer, although he's not officially listed as such. He oversaw a lot of script rewrites, he oversaw casting, and he was the primary one responsible for the hiring of Paul Verhoeven based on his success with RoboCop, which Schwarzenegger had been considered for the starring role. After some final rewrites to account for Arnold's more physical presence, Total Recall was made after almost 16 years in development, 7 different directors, 4 co-writers, 40 script drafts, and many lead actors under consideration for the lead role. All right, pop culture footprint for Total Recall. It was a pretty big one. The film was a financial hit, as you'll see in a moment. There was a comic adaptation from DC Comics. There was a novelization. There was a toy line. There was a video game. In 1999, there was a TV series called Total Recall 2070. And there was a mildly successful reboot film in 2012 starring Colin Farrell that might have been better off as a perfectly competent sci-fi action film titled something else, not having that Total Recall baggage. There are no current projects using the Total Recall IP, but it has been cemented in film history and has been considered a good adaptation of Dick's work by many, if not in terms of its literal use of the source material, then in terms of its understanding of Dick's intentions. In cinema, it's generally thought to be one of the best science fiction films ever made, and that is a real feat considering its quite messy production history. All right, next up, 1997's Starship Troopers. We know our director again, Paul Verhoeven. For this, the third film in his unofficial science fiction trilogy about authoritarian governments that started with RoboCop, continued with Total Recall, and kind of ends here with Starship Troopers. As with Total Recall, we have to mention before we talk about the actual film writing that we have some source material. This time, it's the 1959 Robert Heinlein novel of the same name. So the screenplay was written by Edward Neumeier. Neumeier is known for basically 2 things: this film and RoboCop. 2 incredibly good films, while his other material is maybe, let's just say, less successful. There are several direct-to-video sequels for Starship Troopers. There was a sequel for Anaconda, so perhaps not a great batting average, but hey, 2 successes is 2 more than most of us have. All right, music for this film, leading the way, is Basil Poledouris. Poledouris isn't a household name, but you've likely heard his work. he is known for Conan the Barbarian, Red Dawn, The Hunt for Red October, and Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop. All right, so let's talk cast. It's another fun cast here. Leading the way as high school popular kid and mobile infantry jarhead Johnny Rico is Casper Van Dien. This is what he's most known for among a lot of TV movies, B films, and the occasional appearance in a major theatrical release like Sleepy Hollow or Alita Battle Angel. Usually that happens in smaller roles. Next up is Denise Richards, that is, as Johnny's high school sweetheart and eventual Federation pilot Carbon Ibanez. Richards is also most known for this movie, as well as Wild Things and The World Is Not Enough, among others. Playing Johnny's high school friend, nerd, and future intelligence officer, Carl Jenkins, is Doogie Howser himself, Neil Patrick Harris. In more recent years, of course, Patrick Harris is known for How I Met Your Mother. Dina Meyer plays Hot for Johnny, Dizzy Flores. Meyer is known for this, Johnny Mnemonic, the TV show Birds of Prey, and many other roles. Jake Busey, son of Gary, plays mobile infantryman Ace Levi. Busey is another actor best known for this role, but he's had a long career, including roles in The Frighteners, Twister, and Contact. Clancy Brown plays Sergeant Zim. Brown is known for Highlander, the Shawshank Redemption, and in more recent decades as Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob SquarePants. Michael Ironside is back again, this time as teacher and Lieutenant John Radsick. I don't think I need to summarize Ironside's career again, we just did that. So we'll finish up. We have Patrick Muldoon as Xander Barkalow, Rue McClanahan as biology teacher, as the high school biology teacher. Eric Bruscotter plays Breckenridge, Brenda Strong plays Captain Deladier, and both Marshall Bell and Dean Norris are back in this movie as General Owen and the boot camp commanding officer, respectively. All right, so the writer Neumeier was a big fan of the book, but Verhoeven had never read it, and when he tried to, he hated it. He found it to be a bombastic, pro-military, right-wing, xenophobic piece of propaganda, and he wasn't wrong. So in many ways, the film serves as an opposing viewpoint and satire of its own source material. But there's an additional layer because on a very surface level, this film is a simple celebration of patriotism and violence. It's kind of a big, dumb science fiction special effects extravaganza. On the second level is a fairly obvious satire featuring scenes where government propaganda is being shown to its citizens. In the film, it's mostly ironic and comedic, but it's not completely inaccurate either. The third layer is where the movie has gained additional recognition in recent reevaluations critically. Verhoeven had firsthand experience with Nazi propaganda, having been a child in Nazi-occupied Europe. So his approach was to show the fascist regime as perfect, just like a propaganda film should. He has stated that he was showing a world where fascism worked. Everyone looks great. Everything is clean. The technology is advanced. He takes the satire so far around the bend that it almost catches back up to the source material and seems like propaganda. Verhoeven has also stated that the whole message of the movie is that war makes fascists of us all, and that it's a commentary on a post-Cold War world, that is, where we have no enemies, so we make enemies because we like enemies and we need enemies. So basically, you can take your pick on what you want to get out of this film, whether it's just the science fiction action, or a satire on the source material, or a commentary on human nature. All right. The pop culture footprint for Starship Troopers, at the time it was just kind of okay. The movie made a decent box office, but relative to the budget, maybe not so decent. Claude will talk about the finances in a moment. It also suffered critically because a lot of those additional layers of meaning that I just talked about weren't recognized, especially early on, so that could have contributed to a less than spectacular theatrical run. The film did have video games. There was a pinball game, there was a board game, there were comics from Dark Horse, there was a toy line, there were several direct-to-video sequels, although they are vastly inferior to this film. In modern times, the film has developed a cult fandom more recently, but rumors of a remake or other continuation of the franchise haven't really progressed since around 2016. All right, I think that's it for the basics for these two films. I'm going to forfeit the main seat, and Claude's going to be here with the tale of the tape.
Incoming! Starship Troopers is explosive, wild, an epic thrill ride. You want some? Starship Troopers, rated R, opens everywhere tomorrow.
Greetings, fight fans and movie buffs. I'm your friend Claude, here with the tale of the tape for our main event of the evening. Let's kick it off, as we always do, with the distributing studio. And in the case of Total Recall, we can see that this was put out by TriStar Pictures, and over for Starship Troopers, Sony Pictures did the job. And this time we're leaving the smaller, more obscure companies behind, and we have two of the top flight studios in Hollywood. Moving down to the rating, these are both hard R's. Because, man, they're gory, and they're gruesome, and they're just kind of heavy overall at times. But you know what? What else do you come to see an R-rated movie for? Now let's look at how the running times match up. And these are both meaty movies, but one of them takes the clear lead. Total Recall weighs in at 113 minutes. And the fact that it has so much more scenery changes and constant layers to the journey, for me, feels that it takes longer. But it makes good use. Starship Troopers weighs in at a mighty 130 minutes, and it feels about that long. Release dates? Well, Total Recall came out in right about the beginning of summer, June 1st, 1990, whereas Starship Troopers was released on November 7th, 1997. Now let's look at the budgets. Total Recall was made, again, as seems to be a developing trend on the movies that we pick, for a broad range of anywhere between $48 to $80 million. And Starship Troopers also has a range of anywhere between $100 and $105 million. But what did they do with that budget? And how was their return on investment? Well, Total Recall made $261.4 million. A clear success, any way you look at it. Starship Troopers, well, perhaps if it had cost less to make, would have been a bona fide smash, but on the $100 and change million budget, it made $121.2 million. It seems weird to me because at the time, I don't know if it was advertising or just buzz, but it seemed like it was a big deal. So I was a bit surprised to learn that number. Well, there you have it, the tale of the tape. Now let's open the doors and settle some scores.
All right, we're back and we're going to talk about some scores. First up is 1990's Total Recall, and first up is also me, I think, for this segment.
Let it rip.
All right, so visuals. I am going 8 for Total Recall. Very high score. I think the movie looks great. It holds up fairly well. It's pretty much, in terms of special effects, it's pretty much an old school movie. There is some computer assistance happening, but I think it's being used for what it was used for a lot in that time: computer displays, screen displays, things like that. So there's good matte paintings, there's good optical effects, there's good set design. It's really neat because they don't have to worry about it looking like it's a set because everything is a sort of like cave-dwelling interior. In terms of when they're on Mars, so it really works in their favor. And there's some really the highlights of the movie are really the animatronic pieces. And there's a couple different versions of that where, there's of course the choking in the lack of Mars atmosphere, eyeballs and tongues bulging out. That's very sort of iconic stuff. There's also the lady head bomb that comes off of Arnold, and there's the part where he pulls the probe out of his nose. So a great set of special effects, but also, like I said, the set design, everything looks really good. So I have nothing bad to say about the visuals, and obviously a score of 8 really plays that out. Performances, I go 7. That's a pretty good score. I think this is one of Arnold's stronger performances, and the movie is really played to his strengths. Nothing is quite real about it, and none of the performances really on anybody's part, I don't think, is sort of played realistic. It's all a little bit of camp. It's all a little bit of live action cartoon, and Arnold's face and voice and performance fits into that perfectly.
Absolutely.
This is probably the movie where he does the most classic Arnold noise. He does that many times throughout this movie. When
Get your money's worth.
When he's choking in Mars's atmosphere, when he's being forced, when he's trying to escape the recall chair, when he's trying to be forced into the recall chair later in the movie, all of those scenes have the classic Arnold sounds going on.
That's a technical term.
Yes, don't ask me how to spell it. So, 7 for performances. Next up, writing, I go 7.5. I think this movie, it really plays pretty well. The plot is pretty lean. It's pretty simple from point to point, but it does have, I think it has just the right mix of that sort of that Philip K. Dick paranoia that the story has. They give you just enough of that to make you question what's happening in the movie, but I think that it's to this particular movie's benefit that we don't stay there and focus on that.
Right.
Again, this movie was in production for a long time, and I think if you had stayed in and focused on that, on those elements too much, you would have had something like Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Which the writers didn't want, and that's what David Cronenberg was kind of pushing toward. Now, I love Blade Runner.
Right.
But I think this movie works as its own thing.
Yeah.
And I like that you can have these two very different movies from the same, from source material written by the same guy, Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
And have such different movies, and I think that it's to the benefit that this movie is what it is. All right, so moving on to audio. The movie's competent. I go 6.5. Nothing too special here. The music is good, but it's not very memorable to me. The music is very much secondary to what you're seeing and the other things that are happening in the film. But it's not. There's nothing at fault. I don't have any problems with the audio, with that being the music or the sound effects or the. I don't know. There was a little bit of sort of up and down. And I think you had mentioned, was this sort of like maybe one of the early versions of a film where the audio is down here and the action is very big. But I have to say, it's hard for me to be sure that it's the film and that it wasn't, this very old DVD, remaster that I have that we watched it on, or if it was another effect of the audio in the room. So I don't want to hold that against it. But otherwise, just, competent sounding, and the music, the score gets the job done, but just doesn't stick out to me now after the fact. So those are my scores for Total Recall: 8, 7, 7.5, 6.5. Over to you.
Well, if you're expecting wildly different scores from me, you came to the wrong place. And that's because I am going to see your 8 in the visual category and raise you an 8.5.
One click up.
That's right, just maybe even half a click.
I guess that's technically true.
This movie is visually ridiculous.
Sure.
It's almost absurd at times, the way it looks and some of the effects, but I think it totally works in its favor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually almost refreshing because of that. It's a product of the time. A lot of the extreme scenes that these effects called for, everything you mentioned, especially where he's pulling the probe out of his nose and the tracker, and the head bomb where it's just this lady's face splitting open. Like, these things are not going to look realistic, but in this movie, that's perfectly fine.
Yes.
It just contributes, it reinforces kind of the whole vibe, and it just works perfectly with the way they lay that out.
The world they've built, they just fit.
Yeah, perfectly. So that bleeds over into the performances for me, which I give a 7.5. Again, just a half a notch higher. Mm-hmm. And high marks for the visuals, mostly because it really leans into a specific style and it just pulls it off nicely. And that kind of bleeds over into the performance category, which are equally over the top. And like you said, it's not just Arnold, it's the entire cast. Mm-hmm. Everybody is, in essence, a cartoon character, not in a way that makes it stupid or cheesy. It's the good kind of cheese.
Sure.
But it doesn't take away from enjoyment of the film, it actually reinforces it. And I think that's probably because everybody seems to be buying in. This isn't a thing where it's like, only Arnold is acting weird or something like that. It's like a hyper real type of vibe that you get from it. And you see it in everything from just kind of regular conversation moments to anytime there's a fight scene, every hit is reacted to in the most extreme way. Every like benign punch, they brush each other in the mine hallway and it goes ah. It's almost incapacitating. But again, it all works together synergistically, I think. As far as the writing, again, I'm going to go a little higher and give it an 8. And I feel like most of that score comes from the fact that the story is just comes off very original, very clever, pun intended. And if you watch it, you'll know. I found myself feeling that it was similar in structure and content to The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, and could kind of see that they pulled influences from this movie, and put it in a different setting, of course. But this just at the time, I'm sure, seemed very unique and like something you really needed to go out of your way to see. And as I mentioned in the budget breakdown, I think the numbers back that up. I will say that the story, it gets a little bit convoluted, especially towards the third act, where it just kind of seems after a while that they're just building on top of building on top of building, and I don't want to say it gets lost, but it seems to maybe take a detour on the journey, and probably could have lost a couple of minutes of that. But that's more of a nitpick, really. We're still talking 8 out of 10 for me. As far as the audio goes, I'm going to give it a 6 and actually turn the notch a half crank below. I agree that the score, I guess you'd call me a Jerry Goldsmith fan. I like a lot of the movies that he's done work for, and a lot of them are memorable, and I still randomly get the Rambo theme stuck in my head from time to time. But his work in this movie it's recognizably him, so it has a familiarity, but in terms of any kind of melody leaving an impression, it's really not that memorable. Otherwise, the sound effects and they were fine, but yeah, the kind of unevenness of the dialogue mixed with the music, it was noticeable, but it wasn't bad, and it's probably a result of the period of time where the DVD was released, if anything. And 6 out of 10 is right at the line of good. So once again, my scores: 8.5, 7.5, 8, and 6.
All right, so that's one set of scores. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with another set. As promised, we're back with another set of scores, this time for 1997 Starship Troopers, and this time, Claude goes first.
Well, starting with my visual score for Starship Troopers, I'm going to go with an 8. Very similarly high score for this movie as for Total Recall. But I guess I go, for me, Starship Troopers, that's to just go back down that half a notch. Mainly because it's a 90s movie, even though it's kind of toward the later end of the 90s. And once it starts getting in the higher 90s for me, I start running it together with the early 2000s and expecting them all to kind of have the same level of technology and ability. But I mean, we're still technically in the infancy or the toddler stage of CGI being used in movies. So you still get a nice mix with Starship Troopers for the effects. The movie itself, production design-wise and effects, is very clean visually. As you mentioned, that's kind of a purposeful choice.
Yeah.
It's appealing, but in parts it's a little sterile for me. I think that it's consistent over the course of the movie, and it's a longer movie, so you kind of just get more of the same. And it's not a bad same, it's just it just doesn't do much changing. So, I mean, we're still talking 8 out of 10. For the performances, I actually go down to a 6.5. And, again, that's good plus. The good performances here are pretty good. and it just kind of, you can tell who has been acting for a while and who's pretty new. And it works for the story for the most part, but there is a little roughness, a little, I don't know if I call it hesitation, but there's something in the performances of Denise Richards and even Casper Van Dien that's just a little, feels more like they were used to movies of the week on TV or something, or sitcom guest appearances, and then they're in a movie now. And, you know, again, it's enjoyable. They accomplish the task at hand, but they don't necessarily do it with any impressive level of style or technical achievement for me. Michael Ironside always hits it out of the park. Clancy Brown hits it out of the park. Those guys pull some serious weight in this movie. And actually, among the younger cast, I thought Dina Meyer pulled some weight. She came to play, and she brought her, if not her A game, her B++ game, for sure. But overall, I go 6.5 on performances. As for the writing, I go a 7.5. Overall, I felt it's very solidly written. The story and the plot were pretty easy to follow all the way through, pretty well developed and thought out. However, I will say that there was just a little too much of it. Towards probably the early third act, maybe the whole third act. Again, it's kind of similar with Total Recall. When they reach the insect homeworld and they're spending all the time in the caves and trying to kind of root the bugs out, and there's just a lot that takes place on that same location, and it's just a lot of caves, and a lot of it just kind of goes on for me. I find myself wanting them. It's like, I don't know, man, take some action already or something. And that's really the only part of the movie that I could say that about. Overall, I still think it's a great movie and I enjoy it. But I just felt it could benefit from a little tightness, so 7.5, like I said. As far as the audio for Starship Troopers, I give that a 7. I felt like the sound mixing was far more uneven on this movie, and again, it's hard to know if it's the DVD release or the way it was shown. I have a tendency to believe that it's because it's creeping up towards the end of the 90s, and you kind of begin to see that in movies more and more around that time period. While the score melodically isn't much more memorable, I'm not humming the specific themes that are on screen, but I was much more impacted. I felt the music was more powerful overall, especially there's a scene where one of the roughnecks has been injured and he is given the nuke to kind of be the kind of kamikaze last act of heroism, and that entire scene building up to his sacrifice, it's the music, it's just hammering you, and it really is effective and emotional and just kind of underscores all that very well. Mm-hmm. So there's more moments like that in this movie that I was impressed by. Thus, my score of 7. So, Starship Troopers, final scores for me, 8, 6.5, 7.5, 7. What say you?
All right, so I'm up, and if you're paying attention, you will notice a very consistent trend in the way that our scores compare for this movie. We'll start with visuals, which I'm giving an 8.5. That's half a click above what you scored it, half a click above what I scored Total Recall. I think the movie looks great. It is everything that you said. It's clean. It might even be, you might even call it a little sterile. But again, I do think that is very purposeful, right. So I'm giving it credit for that. I will also say this movie was right on the bleeding edge in terms of CGI. Yeah. It still holds up really, really well. Not perfectly. I think the only time the CGI really suffers is when there's a giant bug. Yeah. Because then the surface rendering is more obvious. It's not quite at the right resolution. Yep. But pretty much anything with the normal soldier-sized bugs looks fantastic still.
I was expecting it not to. I was impressed watching it tonight.
Yeah. With the spaceships, there's still a lot of model work happening. Yep. So that's cool to see. That throwback technique was still in use at that time. Of course, being mixed with CGI when the ships are blowing up and all that sort of thing. Another thing in terms of the effects, I'll give it a lot of credit for, is that everything is brightly lit. so they couldn't, they were not trying, nor could they hide anything.
Right. That's a good point.
Those bugs were walking around in broad daylight for much of the movie, and thousands and hundreds of thousands of bugs, which again is all very impressive. I think, you know, in terms of ambition, I'm not saying that it's necessarily quite as accomplished as something like going way back, The Wizard of Oz,
right.
or the cutting edge of the original Star Wars, or the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. But this movie's like right on that next tier of ambition in its time.
Yeah.
And a lot of movies are ambitious, and then their ambition gets a little heavy, and they fail, and they collapse under the burden. I think this movie was ambitious and pulls it off in terms of the special effects.
Yep.
In terms of everything else, I think it's pretty good. It is kind of, well, I don't want to get too much into to what's leading me down this road because that's more along the writing track, but there are parts of this movie that are very 90s, that late 90s, early 2000s.
Sure.
But I'll get into more about maybe why that is in a moment. But again, visuals, 8.5. Very high score for me. Performances, I'm going 7. So again, half click up from you on this film, and the same score I gave Total Recall. For basically the exact same reasons, though, the exact same high spots, I think. Michael Ironside as Ratsik is really fun and delivers one of my favorite lines in the history of cinema when, with all seriousness, without a hint of irony, he turns dramatically, looking just off camera, and says, "They sucked his brains out." I love it, and he delivers it so well. Again, you already mentioned the high points. It's him. It's Clancy Brown as Sergeant Zim. Dina Meyer as sort of the 4 younger cast. I do think that she's the strong point among them.
Yeah.
Also, I'll give a little bit of kudos to Jake Busey.
Yeah.
Because he oozes charisma.
Yeah. I overlooked that, but you're right.
Yeah, he does. And also, like, you know, Casper Van Dien maybe is not a fantastic actor, but man, does he cut quite like a perfect image on screen. Yeah. He is a human Ken doll. As we were saying when we were watching, it's really surprising that he didn't get more starring roles because I think his acting is competent.
Yeah.
It's satisfactory enough to have been able to do that. And he has every chiseled feature that you'd want in sort of a handsome man. And he has the physique. If he wanted to do action stuff, he could have done that too. So surprising that it didn't happen, but no, you know, he doesn't fail the task, and neither does Denise Richards or Neil Patrick Harris. Nobody fails, but a couple of high spots pushes it up to 7 for me. Moving on to writing, there's kind of a lot to talk about here. You're right about some of your points about the plot starting to get a little convoluted at the end. The dialogue can be super cheesy.
Yeah.
But I also look at the concepts as part of the writing. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is part of the conceptual nature of the movie, at least the campy performances, because you have something that's essentially, it's all those things I talked about in the basics, where this movie serves as just a big dumb science fiction action movie. It also serves as a satire of its own source material. It also serves as 2 or 3 different commentaries on human nature and all that sort of thing. But it also has this thing where it's, even though it takes place in the future, it's very much of its time, because the first third of the movie is basically a microcosm of a high school movie.
Yeah.
It's this movie is almost 3 separate movies, and they pull it off. The first 30 minutes has, you know, sort of like the relationship difficulties of the main characters. There's the big game. Mm-hmm. There's the big dance.
Yeah, it's all there.
And then if you kind of ended it with them all saying, "Hey, let's make a pact that we'll always be friends," you could get to to sort of an ending there, actually. But then the movie goes on and becomes something else, and then it turns into something like Full Metal Jacket, and then you get to the war movie at the end where they're actually fighting the bugs.
Right.
And then, you know, Carl comes back and he's wearing what's basically a Nazi jacket. I mean, it's really something. I mean, he's got this long cloak.
Outfit, yeah.
So it's not a subtle. They are not subtle suggestions. So I actually appreciate the movie. I'm giving it an 8 because I like all that ambition. I like those layers, and I really think that structure is great. And I love sort of the comedic satire. Verhoeven kind of returning to that from his days at RoboCop, or from his time doing RoboCop, because you don't see that in Total Recall. You don't. I mean, there's like one commercial for like the Recall company.
Yeah.
but that's not really a focus. Like here, you have stuff that's right in front of you. Do you want to know more?
Right.
So I thought that was really clever that they worked that stuff in, because it's the perfect fascist government. But then they show you that to sort of like show you the chinks in the armor.
Yeah.
All right, so that moves me on to audio. I'm giving it a 7.5. Again, very similar to you. I mean, I think there was a little bit more creativity in some of the sound effects. You had bug sound effects and ship sound effects, and you had the bugs splurting space goo out of their asses up into space. That had its own sound effect. But the music is also a big part of it. Like you said, there's a much more sort of powerful score underlying what's happening on screen. It's very, again, it fits perfectly into his whole was seemingly Verhoeven's mission of creating a propaganda film for a government that's not real in a literal
Right.
sense. There's a lot of irony there, so that's a big reason why my audio score is pretty high. So those are my scores for Starship Troopers. Once again, 8.5, 7, 8, and 7.5. So we've done all of our scores now. We're going to do some math, and we're going to be back with the big board. And we're back. As I said, we've got the big board, and we've got some final scores. First, Total Recall with a score of 7.38, and Starship Troopers with a score of 7.5, and the win today. I feel like this might be a slight upset, but first, any sort of initial reactions on your side of the board?
Yeah, I feel like I kind of agree that it's a bit of an upset. I think I personally like Total Recall a little bit more overall. But I feel like also Starship Troopers probably deserves the win, but they're so close that nobody has any reason to be embarrassed or hang their weirdly shaped prosthetic head in shame. Yeah, good results.
You're right. I mean, both good scores. I mean, a seven and change is a pretty good score on the show.
Yeah.
And they both obviously are above that. And really, it's just a little bit over a tenth of difference total. So it's a very close score. Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, at any given time, if I were to rank my favorite movies, they're always going to be a little different each time depending on my mood. Both of these movies at any given time flirt with being in my top 5. So I really do like them both. I think on instinct, I would probably say I do like Starship Troopers a little bit more, and that plays out here. But I mean, I think they're both really good. And I just want to mention again, I mentioned this a little bit when I was doing the basics. Arnold Schwarzenegger has struggled in 2 appearances on the show. His later film, The Sixth Day, did not score very well. And he shows up in our Batman Battle Royal episode. And of course, he is Mr. Freeze in Batman and Robin, and that was the lowest ranked of the Batman movies on that show.
Right.
So happy to see him show up and have a good showing. Not just his movie, but also his performance was really fun. So anyway, yeah, his performance was really good in that movie, and his movie scores well. But so anyway, we have Starship Troopers with the slight edge here, getting the win on a decision. I don't think there's even any kind of a technical knockout or a finish in this match. So before we close anything out, any final thoughts?
Well, as you alluded to, dialogue is important on our show, and as I did in the previous episode, I'm going to leave you with the 2 memorable quotes that struck me the hardest. Total Recall, it's not the splashiest, it's not the funnest, but for some reason it just always sticks with me, and that is when he kind of pulls off, or I guess Michael Ironside's arms get kind of removed from his body as he falls to his death, and Schwarzenegger says, "See you at the party, Richter." Just, I don't know why, it just kind of puts some sort of emphasis that sticks in my brain, and it's the right amount of absurd. And of course, Michael Ironside again for me in Starship Troopers, taking the quote of the evening with "Have fun, that's an order." An important life lesson we could all learn from.
All right. So I guess that'll do it for this episode of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies. Here we are on YouTube. You've already found us. You can also find us on Instagram at NerdBomberPod, and that's a good place to go for links to all the things we do. So for your friend Claude, I've been Just Jamie, and until the next battle,
Aloha.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. The perfect gift for any occasion, gift certificates are available at the box office. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.